Human consciousness is usually treated as a binary. You are either awake and processing the world, or asleep and offline. The observer-dependent theory of everything models awareness as a physical property that oscillates along a scale. Look at this timeline. If full waking consciousness sits at a stable integer like 3, the states in between, like deep sleep or meditative trances, occupy the infinite spectrum of fractional dimensions, filling the gaps. We exist as shifting frequencies of observation. Our grip on the physical world changes based on where we sit on this dimensional scale. In deep sleep, our baseline dimensionality hits its floor. The cognitive focus required to process the external world drops to 0, pulling awareness inward. As we drift into REM sleep or the territory of lucid dreaming, we enter intermediate fractional states. Our mind's recursive layers partially open, allowing us to process internal data without full access to the outside world. When morning comes, that frequency ramps up. We transition back into full wakefulness, regaining our maximum dimensional capacity and our physical anchor to reality. This chart maps that daily oscillation as a mathematical curve. Our effective dimensionality tracks along a predictable rhythm, dipping to a baseline of 3.0 in the dead of night and peaking around 3.5 at midday. Because individual consciousness is fluid, these shifting frequencies naturally interact. When we step out into the world and encounter other people, our oscillating states collide, influence one another, and under the right conditions, they fuse. Step back from the single mind and look at a crowded room, a dedicated work team, or an entire society. When a group reaches a critical mass and achieves a high level of alignment, the mathematics of the crowd trigger a phase transition. This alignment births an egregore, an emergent meta-observer. It develops collective focus, shared memory, and independent agency driven by the group's unified attention. Once formed, this entity cannot be reduced to the sum of its members. It scales exponentially, establishing an entirely new structural boundary. Human collectives, in this framework, are literal higher-order life forms. They exert a top-down influence, shaping the attention and actions of the individuals operating inside them. Depending on what binds the group together, this emergent societal architecture faces one of two distinct asymmetrical destinies. A coherent cluster, often called a light egregore, is bound by voluntary connection. Because its members share an aligned, constructive goal, internal contradictions fade away, creating a highly stable system. An anti-coherent cluster operates in reverse. It is united purely by a shared, destructive vector of attention directed outward. Because a destructive group is riddled with internal distrust, it lacks natural coherence. The structure relies entirely on external coercion to hold together. The math guarantees permanent struggle. The group fights the outside world, other clusters, and eventually internal friction fractures the external shell. Systems built on coercion and destruction, like cults or totalitarian regimes, are mathematically doomed to short lifespans. The act of forcing alignment destroys the very coherence required for the group to survive. We've traced observation from the oscillating sleep cycles of a single mind up to the rise and fall of massive societal entities. So where does this progression actually end? The ODTOE framework calculates the lifespan of an entity as a function of its internal coherence. If that alignment reaches a perfect state of 100%, the math suggests the observer's duration becomes theoretically infinite. There is a paradox built into that kind of perfection. If an entity stops developing and stays fixed in place, it eventually runs out of new configurations in the universe to observe. This leads to coherent stagnation. Without a flow of new information to process, the observer is left with nothing to look at, and its focus drops to 0. This occurs because cognitive coherence is built on a multiplicative structure. Since focus, memory, and emotional resilience are multiplied together, if focus drops to 0, the entire system holding the observer together cancels out. Reaching a perfect fixed state and simply stopping is a trap. Immortality at a static dimension contradicts its own mathematical requirements. To avoid stagnation and maintain the focus necessary for life, an observer must continuously expand into higher dimensions, finding new configurations to process. This necessity for endless expansion scales all the way up to the highest concepts of the absolute, or what we might call God. But an absolute entity exists at an infinite dimensionality. Because our capacity to observe is bounded by our own level, finite human minds face a structural limit. We cannot fully define or measure the infinite. This reveals a fundamental cycle of the universe. To exist is to grow. If an observer stops expanding their consciousness and exhausts the configurations available at their current level, they mathematically fade away.